At 76, Sally Field finally gave voice to a truth that had been quietly circling the edges of public awareness for decades. It wasn't a tabloid bombshell. It wasn't a bitter tell-all. It was a quiet, clear confession, delivered with the weight of time and reflection. For years, fans had speculated about the nature of her romance with Burt Reynolds. They were one of Hollywood's most iconic pairings, both on-screen and off, especially after their unforgettable chemistry in Smokey and the Bandit. But behind the glitz and charm was something far more complicated. And now, with the release of her memoir In Pieces, published just days after Burt's death, Sally confirmed what so many had long suspected. The relationship wasn't enchanted. It was dysfunctional. She didn't mince words. She spoke of emotional entanglement, control, and an intensity that sometimes bordered on the unhealthy. While Reynolds had, in his final years, repeatedly declared her the love of his life, Sally's version of the story was less romantic and far more real. It wasn't a story of fairy tale love. It was a portrait of two flawed people who collided at the wrong time, in the wrong way, under the blinding spotlight of fame. And now, after decades of silence, Sally is ready to tell the whole truth. The instant attraction on Smokey and the Bandit. Their paths crossed in 1977 on the set of what would become one of the most beloved road comedies of the era, Smokey and the Bandit. From the very first table read, there was a charge between them. Not just romantic chemistry, but something deeper, more volatile. The kind of connection that could light up a room or burn it down. Sally would later describe it not as love at first sight, but as something more intense and less controllable. It was deeply entangled, she said. And that entanglement wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological. A bond that blurred the lines between character and reality. On camera, their chemistry was undeniable. Off camera, it simmered. The entire set buzzed with whispers. Crew members noticed how they gravitated toward each other between takes, exchanging long glances and quiet conversations. It didn't feel like a fling. It felt like a storm waiting to happen. And it did. Sally admitted that being around Burt felt like being pulled into a force field, equal parts attraction and imbalance. She couldn't quite resist it, even when she sensed the warning signs, because in those early days, he made her feel special, chosen, adored. But that attention would soon take a darker turn. He called her the love of my life. To the outside world, Burt Reynolds was the definition of swagger, confident, charming, in full control of every room he walked into. But in his more vulnerable moments, especially later in life, he returned again and again to one name, Sally. In a 2015 interview, just 3 years before his death, Reynolds openly called her the love of my life. He claimed he'd been infatuated with her since childhood, even saying he fell for her as early as age 7 after seeing her perform. It sounded romantic, storybook even. He also had a warm bond with Sally's mother, often spending time at her home and maintaining a family-like connection. Fans saw it as proof that theirs was a love that, though fractured, had never truly disappeared. But Sally's version wasn't so simple. In her memoir, she doesn't outright deny that Burt loved her, but she makes it clear that love, as she experienced it, was complicated and often manipulative. What he remembered as affection, she often experienced as control. What he framed as devotion, she now saw as part of a pattern, one that was far more damaging than dreamy. For her, his repeated declarations of love were tinged with sadness, not because they weren't real, but because they came too late to undo the harm. The Confession of Control and Jealousy. As Sally Field began writing her memoir, she started to trace patterns, not just of affection, but of power dynamics that had shaped her life. And when it came to Burt Reynolds, one pattern became painfully clear: control. At first, his attention felt flattering. His charisma could fill an auditorium. But slowly, it became something else. Sally wrote that Burt's fame didn't just elevate him. It gave him tools. Tools he used to shape her behavior, her schedule, even her sense of self-worth. She said he disapproved of her rising stardom. When she landed critically acclaimed roles, he responded with distance or subtle disapproval. She recalled moments where he wouldn't attend major events, the Cannes Film Festival, the Oscars, because the spotlight would be on her, not him. The message was clear. Her success made him uncomfortable. The more she shone, the more he pulled away. And eventually, his jealousy became an invisible leash, one she didn't even realize was tightening until years later. "He couldn't emotionally hold my success," she wrote. And for a woman just coming into her own power as an actress and a person, that realization was devastating. What began as passion had twisted into resentment and emotional sabotage. The perfect match of flaws. Despite everything, the control, the imbalance, the emotional games, Sally still describes her relationship with Burt as something profoundly mirrored. She doesn't deny there was love, but she calls it something even more complicated. A perfect match of flaws. She admitted she fell into the relationship blindly, as though following a script she hadn't written but couldn't stop performing. It was only later, through therapy and reflection, that she understood what that script was made of: trauma. Their bond wasn't just romantic, it was reflective, each of them carrying emotional wounds from childhood and unconsciously recreating those patterns in their adult lives. For Sally, that meant falling into pre-programmed behavior, quietly accommodating, overly forgiving, minimizing her own discomfort to maintain peace. The emotional echo between them, she says, was as powerful as it was destructive. They didn't fall in love. They fell into a familiar trap. It wasn't healthy, but it was hard to escape. Because somewhere inside all that dysfunction, there was real affection. But affection without accountability, she now knows, is not the same as love. Their story was never built for a happy ending, but it was built to teach her something she hadn't yet learned. He was not nice by the end. By the time the relationship began to fray, Sally Field was no longer the same woman who had fallen for Burt Reynolds. Her career was rising, her confidence was growing, and her understanding of emotional boundaries had begun to sharpen. And with that clarity came a painful realization. Burt wasn't being kind anymore. In an interview with the New York Times, Sally spoke plainly. She described their time together as becoming confusing, complicated, hurtful. The charm that had once drawn her in was now weaponized, turned cold, withholding, sometimes cruel. As her star began to rise, Burt began to pull away, not just physically, but emotionally. He didn't want to share the spotlight, and worse, he didn't want to acknowledge her talent when it threatened to outshine his. That shift, subtle at first, grew into a widening chasm. Sally wrote that he became emotionally distant and often manipulative. He used his stardom like a shield, and at times, like a sword, undermining her confidence when he sensed she was getting too strong. She remembered the moment she realized the warmth had left his eyes. It wasn't just a cooling of affection, it was a defense mechanism. Burt couldn't celebrate her victories because, deep down, he feared losing control. The man who once professed eternal love had become someone she no longer recognized. And while she didn't hate him, she could no longer ignore the damage. The worst on-screen kiss ever. In 2022, Sally Field appeared on a talk show, surrounded by laughter, warm nostalgia, and a few cheeky questions about her legendary film career. But when asked about her most disappointing on-screen kiss, she didn't hesitate. "Burt Reynolds," she said. "A lot of drooling." The audience laughed. The host blinked in surprise. It was the kind of quip that plays well on daytime television. Humorous, disarming, just cheeky enough. But behind the laugh was something more revealing. Sally wasn't just talking about a clumsy movie moment. She was signaling the gap between appearance and reality. The kiss may have looked electric on camera, but behind the scenes, the intimacy wasn't romantic. It was complicated and often performative. That one joke, that single sentence, said more than paragraphs could. It told the truth about how their physical chemistry never fully aligned with emotional safety. How even at their most romantic, something always felt off. She later clarified that it wasn't meant to humiliate him. It was a truth she'd carried for years, not about a kiss, but about a relationship that never truly felt equal. And sometimes, the messiness of love reveals itself in the smallest details, like a kiss that doesn't quite land the way it should. The 30-year silence. After the dust settled, the cameras stopped rolling, and the love that once felt endless faded into memory. Sally Field made a quiet but firm decision. She would no longer speak to Burt Reynolds. For the final 30 years of his life, they never spoke directly again. Not once. Burt, for his part, seemed to struggle with that silence. In interview after interview, he referenced her, sometimes tenderly, sometimes with regret. He called her the one that got away. He praised her talent. He called her the best. But she never responded. Not publicly, not privately, not even when friends encouraged her to reach out. And the reason, she said, was simple. She had made peace with walking away. She didn't want to rekindle an emotional fire she had worked so hard to extinguish. She didn't want to hear more apologies or revisit the past, because for her, the distance wasn't about bitterness. It was about self-preservation. Even after his death, she acknowledged his pain, but said clearly she had no desire to return to the dynamic that had once consumed her. Sometimes, healing means choosing silence over sentiment. And for Sally, the silence was necessary. It was the final boundary she refused to let anyone cross. Her gratitude. He never read her memoir. When in Pieces was published in 2018, the timing was haunting. Burt Reynolds died just days before its release. And in one of her most emotionally complex admissions, Sally Field said she was glad he never got to read it. Not because she hated him, not because she wanted to erase the past, but because, as she put it, it would have hurt him too deeply. The book wasn't written to condemn him, it was written to tell the truth, her truth, about a young woman trying to find herself in an industry that so often asked her to disappear, and about a relationship that, despite its glamour, was riddled with imbalance and emotional confusion. She feared Burt would have taken it personally, that he would have misread honesty for attack, and in his final years, she wanted to protect him from that pain, even if it meant keeping her distance. That mix of compassion and clarity defines much of Sally's perspective now. She didn't write to destroy. She wrote to reclaim. And in acknowledging that Burt never saw those pages, she admitted a deeper truth. Some truths are best left unsaid to the people they could harm, even if those truths are vital to say out loud. On The View. Celebrity commentary. When Sally's memoir made headlines, the public response was swift. But nowhere was the commentary sharper than on The View. The co-hosts didn't hold back. Ana Navarro called it a textbook example of fragile male ego. She pointed to Burt's refusal to support Sally at major award shows, a pattern of emotional sabotage disguised as distance. Joy Behar called it classic old-school Hollywood chauvinism. Even Whoopi Goldberg weighed in, saying, "When a man can't handle a woman's success, that's not love, that's insecurity." Their discussion echoed exactly what Sally had hinted at for years, that behind the charm, Burt had struggled to celebrate her, that his masculinity was tangled in his need to be superior, even to the woman he loved. The public finally saw what Sally had lived through, and for once, the spotlight turned, not on her pain, but on the culture that allowed it to fester in silence for so long. Because Sally's story wasn't just personal, it was universal. How his fame turned toxic. At first, Burt Reynolds' fame had been dazzling. The charm, the access, the effortless command of a room. Sally Field had never experienced anything like it. But that magnetism, she later realized, came with a shadow. In the early stages of their relationship, his celebrity felt like a shield, protective, powerful. But over time, that same power began to bend. What once drew her in started to control her. Sally detailed moments where Burt would use his stardom to manipulate the world around them. Not overtly, not always cruelly, but with an unmistakable edge of dominance. He would determine who they spoke to, where they went, what she wore, how she was perceived. And the further her own fame began to rise, the tighter that control became. There was one particularly crushing moment. Burt banned her from attending an awards show where she had been nominated. The message was clear, not in words, but in energy. Her success was a threat, and the solution was to clip her wings before she could fly higher. Sally saw the pattern for what it was: professional sabotage wrapped in romantic entanglement. She tried to rationalize it, excuse it, soften it. But deep down, she knew. Burt couldn't handle losing the spotlight, and he especially couldn't handle sharing it. His fame had stopped being something that lit her path. It had become the thing casting the longest shadow. Healing past wounds. By the time Sally Field sat down to write In Pieces, she wasn't just telling the story of a career. She was excavating a life, layer by layer, heartbreak by heartbreak. It wasn't about celebrity anymore. It was about survival. She didn't just revisit memories. She retraced them. Like scars beneath the surface, each relationship, each role, each choice started to connect. And when she examined her years with Burt Reynolds, one devastating truth surfaced. She had been reenacting an old wound. In one of the memoir's most shattering revelations, Sally opened up about being sexually abused by her stepfather, actor Jock Mahoney. It happened in silence, over years, in a home that should have been safe. And that betrayal, that early, intimate violation, left a mark far deeper than even she had understood at the time. The trauma didn't vanish. It disguised itself. It showed up in the way she deferred, the way she silenced her own needs, the way she gravitated toward powerful men who made her feel small, but needed. And in Burt Reynolds, that pattern found a perfect match. He was everything she had learned to both crave and fear: charming, emotionally unpredictable, dominant. The kind of man who made her feel special one moment and invisible the next. She didn't just fall in love. She fell back into something familiar. "I was exorcising something through him," she wrote. It wasn't a poetic metaphor. It was a raw truth. Their relationship wasn't just a love story. It was a manifestation of old pain playing itself out, over and over, in real time. The control didn't just come from Burt. It came from within her, from a wounded part that had internalized the idea that love required submission, that approval came at a cost, that discomfort was normal. She had never been taught to ask for safety, only to survive without it. It wasn't until years later, with distance, therapy, and the hard-earned wisdom of age, that she saw the full shape of what she had lived through. Burt wasn't the origin of her pain, but he had become a reflection of it. And leaving him wasn't just the end of a toxic romance, it was the beginning of something radical, her healing. She started to understand that her voice mattered, that her needs weren't a burden, that love wasn't supposed to feel like a battlefield. Writing her memoir became a form of liberation, each sentence an exhale, each chapter a wound reopened and finally cleaned. For the first time, she wasn't performing. She was processing, reclaiming, naming what had gone unnamed for decades. And in doing so, she didn't just set herself free from Burt. She set herself free from the legacy of silence that had haunted her since childhood. Because true healing doesn't begin when the pain ends. It begins when you finally stop hiding it. A love that couldn't evolve. Even now, when Sally Field speaks about Burt Reynolds, there's no bitterness, no venom, no impulse to rewrite history with resentment. Her voice, instead, carries something quieter, something sadder. It's the ache of remembering a love that once held promise but never had the foundation to grow. A connection that burned bright and fast, but couldn't survive the weight of real life. She admits there was love, real love, at least for a while. There were moments when she believed in it, when it felt right, even fated. But the kind of love they shared wasn't built to last. It wasn't patient. It wasn't steady. It didn't have the strength to stretch. It was the kind of love that consumes first and collapses after. She described Burt as magnetic, deeply charming, and deeply wounded. A man who could make you feel like the only person in the world until you threatened to outshine him. Then he'd pull away, retreat into silence, or try to pull you back down. He was not someone I could be around, she wrote, in what may be the memoir's most sobering and heartbreaking line. That wasn't a dig. It was a realization. Because the more she grew, as a woman, as an actress, as a person, the more she recognized that their dynamic couldn't stretch with her. It wasn't built for her full self. It had only ever held space for a smaller version of who she was. As she stepped into her own power, garnering awards, respect, and control over her own narrative, Burt's presence became a weight. The support she needed wasn't there. Instead, she faced subtle resistance, jealousy masked as indifference, affection laced with quiet sabotage. It wasn't sustainable. It wasn't safe. It wasn't love. Not the kind that lasts. So she did what so few people can bring themselves to do. She walked away. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in clarity, in compassion. Because she didn't stop caring for him. She didn't erase what they shared. But she finally understood something crucial. To stay would mean shrinking. To stay would mean giving up parts of herself that had finally started to bloom. She left not just a man, but a pattern. A lifetime of accepting less, of molding herself to fit someone else's comfort zone, of confusing intensity with intimacy, control with connection. And in leaving, she broke the cycle that had kept her small. She chose herself, not in a selfish way, but in a sovereign way. And that decision, made quietly but firmly, became a turning point in her life. Because sometimes the deepest act of love isn't staying through the storm. It's walking away when you realize the weather will never change. Why she's speaking out. Now there's a weight that comes with silence. Not the kind that screams to be broken, but the kind that settles in your bones. That becomes part of how you move, how you speak, how you protect yourself from being misunderstood. For years, Sally Field carried her truth like a locked diary, a private ache, tightly sealed. She didn't deny what had happened between her and Burt Reynolds, but she also never let it live in the open. Not because she was afraid of the press or of being judged, but because, at her core, she didn't want to hurt him. There was still tenderness in her silence, still a flicker of care, despite the pain. But now, at 76, something inside her has shifted. The years have given her perspective, and with that, permission. Permission to stop carrying other people's reputations on her back. Permission to stop rewriting her story to make it more palatable, less controversial, easier for the world to swallow. "I'm not afraid to be misunderstood anymore," she said. And maybe that's the greatest freedom age can give. With Burt gone, the emotional tug-of-war that had kept her story half-buried finally ended. There's no longer a risk of backlash, no longer a man waiting in the wings to give his side and twist the narrative into something safer for himself. What's left is her voice, clear, honest, unfiltered. "It's time," she said simply. Time to be open, time to be whole, time to tell her side without shame. Because In Pieces wasn't written to tear anyone down. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a scandal seeker's confession. It was a release. A way for Sally to reclaim the years she spent shrinking, second-guessing, apologizing for being too much, too emotional, too successful. It was her way of speaking to the younger version of herself, and to every woman who has ever walked through a relationship that felt more like an echo of their trauma than a celebration of their worth. She wanted those women to hear her voice and think, "You're not crazy, you're not wrong, and you're not alone." Because the shame isn't in telling the truth, it's in pretending for too long that the truth doesn't matter. And by finally letting the story live in the daylight, Sally isn't rewriting the past. She's rewriting the rules of who owns it. She's freeing herself from it. No more caretaking someone else's legacy at the expense of her own. No more muting herself for the comfort of others. No more biting her tongue in the name of peace. This is her story, messy, complicated, full of love and loss. And for the first time, she's letting it belong to no one else but her. What we can all learn. Sally Field's confession isn't just about Burt Reynolds. It's not just about the glitz of Hollywood or the intimacy behind closed doors. It's about the quiet, complicated truth so many people live with and rarely say aloud. It's about all the different versions of love we're taught to accept. The passionate kind that sweeps you off your feet. The possessive kind that feels flattering until it becomes suffocating. The magnetic kind that consumes you, then leaves you in pieces. The manipulative kind that disguises control as care. We grow up with stories, romantic comedies, sweeping novels, celebrity couples on red carpets, telling us that love should be thrilling, that intensity equals devotion, that jealousy means someone really cares, and when someone calls you the love of their life, it's supposed to be a compliment, a fairy tale ending. But Sally's story makes us ask harder questions. What happens when that love also holds you back? What happens when the words are sweet, but the actions keep dimming your light? Because the truth is, real love, Healthy, sustaining love doesn't ask you to shrink. It doesn't see your success as competition. It doesn't silence your voice or rewrite your story. Real love is spacious. It lets you grow. It allows you to be brilliant, to be messy, to be yourself, without fear that you'll lose it, by simply being more. Sally's journey is both a cautionary tale and a quiet redemption. Not because she walked away from some great love, but because she finally realized she was worth more than what she was settling for. And maybe that's what we all need to hear, that chemistry isn't the same as commitment, that a person's charm doesn't guarantee their character, that someone can make you feel adored and still not be the one who builds you up. Because deep affection and damage can absolutely coexist. And it takes strength, not bitterness, to name both. Sally loved Burt. She doesn't deny that. But she also tells the truth about how that love was tangled, uneven, and, at times, painful. And that's what makes her story so powerful. It lives in the gray area, where so many real relationships exist. The people we love the most can also be the ones who hurt us the deepest. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do isn't staying or fighting, it's leaving, quietly, firmly, and finally. Because when we walk away from something that's no longer safe, no longer nourishing, no longer honest, we don't just escape pain, we reclaim our peace. We step out of survival. We step into wholeness. And that is love, too. The love we give ourselves when all the other kinds have let us down. At 76, Sally Field finally confirmed what we all suspected. Her love story with Burt Reynolds wasn't a Hollywood fairy tale, but a tangled emotional reckoning. Behind the charm was control. Behind the silence, survival. And now, her truth stands not as scandal, but as strength. She lived it, and she let go.